So now we're going to welcome Mark Bryan. He's coming from New Zealand. He's the managing director of Vet South, and he's chair of their AMR group as part of the New Zealand Veterinary Association. And as Mark prepares to talk, can I just remind him that the Ireland under-20s beat the All Black under-20s in the Rugby World Cup recently, and he can look forward to further such events in the future. So,
thank you.
So his presentation is Antimicrobial Use in Dairy Cattle in New Zealand, a national and regional benchmarking study. So you're very welcome.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks for staying with me. And if you can't hear me very well, it's because last night the music was too loud and I can hardly speak. If you're more interested in rugby, I'm happy to talk about rugby for half an hour. We've had too much AMR. So I guess that just to take a step back, and we keep on getting told that we're in the middle of this global crisis, and it's a crisis of our own making. It's a complete disaster, and I just want to give a sense of perspective around that, because I think, and you've heard today, we're doing a lot of work in this space, and I want to balance it up with these guys. So if you remember back in, those of you that were around in 1999, when Bill Clinton wasn't otherwise occupied, he busy he signed off a bill that allowed from Congress that allowed banks to change the way they behaved, and instead of just being either investment or commercial banks, they were allowed to merge and do both. And of course, we all know what that happened. They developed things like these collateralized debt obligations. They had mortgage upon mortgage upon mortgage, and they speculated. And basically, within 9 years, they brought the global financial community to crisis. And I would argue that vets and doctors and whatnot are far more responsible than the bankers. And I don't know if that's a good benchmark, but it's taken us 90 years to get to what may or may not be a crisis, and we're actually taking a lot of steps to avert that. And just to put it also into context, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, they had $600 billion of debt, and they had only $15 billion of liquid equity. So if any of you have got dairy farmers out there that are a little bit worried about their debt to equity ratio in the current environment, you just need to point them towards the bankers and say it's not too bad. So this is the kind of graph kind of chart that you'll see. This is the kind of thing that people say, well, look, there's a whole bunch of, this is the MRSA, and you can pull out a whole bunch of these sort of data from around the world. And obviously the differing shades mean differing severities of prevalence of MRSA. And in this context, being a lighter shade is not always positive. It just means that we haven't got a bloody clue what's going on. So in areas of Africa and whatnot, we really just don't know. There is no data, or there are no data. The backstop to this story is that last year the NZVA released this statement, and this was what we call our aspirational statement, that by 2030 we would not need antibiotics for the maintenance of and health and welfare in animals. And I've been really interested in the speakers today because, I guess the motivation behind that from an NZVA perspective was seeing what was coming over the horizon in Europe. The last thing we really wanted to do was to be dictated to by politicians, and I hope there's no politicians in the room, but they don't always make the best decisions, as you've seen in the past couple of weeks in Europe. And so I can remember being sat in a room with MPI and some politicians where we were told that within 2 years we will not be using dry cow therapy, and that was just a decision that came out of his head. And it kind of scared us. And so with this statement, what we're not saying is that we won't use antibiotics. We're saying that we won't need to use them. So we'll have a whole bunch of other strategies and solutions. And more importantly, the subtext of this is that we will absolutely retain the right to use them for treatment. That's absolutely what we need to have. So that was the key thing. And really what we were doing is taking ownership of that space. And it's actually, to be quite honest, been quite effective. I was very interested as well with the discussion about farmers and vets, because when you talk to farmers, farmers get this. Farmers sort of like the idea. They think of antibiotic use as a cost, and they want to find novel situations. When you talk to vets, they're very slow to get this. So our biggest resistance has been from vets, who, let's be honest, are entirely conflicted because they're selling the bloody stuff. And I always point out to them that I probably make more money than they do selling antibiotics, and I support this. So it's ownership of that space. How do you measure antimicrobial use? Well, we've heard a couple of ways. So our government measures it by tonnage, which is very crude, 52 tons a year, whatever, it doesn't really mean much. We've heard about animal-defined dosage and drug usage rate. And there isn't a perfect system. I think that's the point. And Teo's already pointed out that even with ADD, there's not coherence between what we do in New Zealand and what we do in Europe or even in North America. You can do it by area, and so this is interesting. As somebody mentioned the population density of animals, and here's an interesting graph on area, and pointing out the consumption of in livestock by 10 kilometre pixels. So you can start to see that in China and in Europe, especially in Holland, there's an awful lot of antimicrobial consumption, but it hasn't got any denominator data. So we've got... It hasn't got any denominator data. And the other thing you'll notice about this in international literature is you cherry pick what you want to show how good your country is and how bad the Netherlands are, So that's what you try and do. A bit like the bloody rugby. For what I'm going to report here, we've used population corrected units. So this is milligrams of active ingredient per kilogram of biomass. Now, it's a very useful, we published some data on this I'm going to show you, and the reason we do this is because in New Zealand we're not overly good at getting good farm level and cow level data, but we've got good generic data, and this is very good for population data and biomass data at a regional or at a country level, and as long as you can measure and you've got some understanding of the sales or the use of antimicrobials. So we're using PCU. And we published this paper this year, and so what we did is we got all the available reports and literature and whatnot from where we had that sort of information available, and we converted where we could all the data to PCUs. And see, there's a huge range in there from, I've got no idea what happens in Cyprus. If anybody's from Cyprus, you might want to explain some of this to me, but Cyprus uses a phenomenal amount of antimicrobials. And Italy too, Italy's got a very high consumption of antimicrobials at PCU level. In this paper, New Zealand is the third lowest user of antimicrobials in livestock after Iceland and Norway. And so this is all livestock. This includes chickens and pigs and basically the entire biomass. And so that was that data was similarly repeated. O'Neill's report this year came up with very similar data from very similar sources. So in some respects, New Zealand's in a good space. We're not using a huge amount of antimicrobials, and that's been some of the kickback from veterinarians saying, well, why have this aspirational goal when we don't have a problem? So, I can understand that reaction. What we've done in this little project was pull a bunch of data, and this is from the Well Farm program, which is Animal Health and Welfare project we've got running for the past 3 years, and if anyone's interested, I'm reporting on that tomorrow. And we took the data, sales data, from these 4 regions, from the vet clinics, and in New Zealand, virtually all the antimicrobials are sold through vet clinics. The challenge around denominator data is always there, and I don't know how other countries deal with it. We're fortunate because we have seasonal calving. So we take, and for our case, the denominator data in this is the number of cows and heifers wintered just prior to calving. So that's an important category. And then we pulled out the sales data, standardized the animal weights, so it's reasonably generic. So we didn't go down to the farm or cow level, we just standardized them according to dairy New Zealand figures. And what did we find? Well, we had 68,000 cows in the data set, and this is the antimicrobial use in PCU, broken down by the 4 regions and the total. And so the average was 8.6 PCU, which is not unreasonable. And very interestingly, the vast majority of our antimicrobial use is penicillin. If you take the penicillin out, because it completely swamps the data set, and start to look more at some of the other things, you see there's actually some really interesting regional variations around specific use. So cephalosporin use, for whatever reason, is much higher in the North Canterbury region than it is in other areas. And similarly, macrolides change. So what you're seeing is it's almost a juxtaposition of you either use a lot of cephalosporins or you use a lot of tetracyclines or whatever. I've lost the screen, so apologies to those guys on the left. The other question that was asked is, The other question that was asked is, where does it all go? And when you measure it by a PCU, you get slightly different outcomes. But what we find is that half of our antibiotic by PCU is injectable, and an awful lot of it is dry cow therapy. So dry cow therapy is the big elephant in the room. It comes up a lot. And in fact, I've sat at One Health conferences where they're unaware that there's vets in the audience, and we're severely challenged on our dry cow therapy approach. They just cannot understand why you would treat 1,000 cows with 600 milligrams of long-acting cloxacillin, in all 4 quarters. It just goes against every belief they've got. So dry cow antibiotic therapy is quite important. And I did a bit of data analysis just from our client base from the past 2 years, and this is just antibiotic dry cow therapy, because we do believe that there's a financial impact on farmers, and so we believe we see the effect of, if the milk payout drops, that they change their behaviour. But very interestingly, between the past 2 years, there's been an almost identical amount of cows used dry cow antimicrobial therapy. So about 66% of our cows routinely get dry cow antimicrobial therapy. So just in terms of where that data stacks up in terms of other stuff, this is the 2012 data that we published earlier this year. Eric Hillerton and myself and others, sitting around 9.2 for all species in New Zealand. And these are the data from our practice in the past 3 years. This is only for dairy cattle, so this is 8.4, popped up again, 9.6, that's dropped back down. And interestingly enough, the well farm, so the farmers that are on the animal health and welfare program in our clinic actually have a higher antimicrobial use than the other farmers. And that's an interesting social concept. So it may be, given New Zealand's remarkably low usage of antimicrobials, that better farmers actually use more because they have better welfare outcomes. It may be that there's a sweet spot we actually use too little, and that's something we haven't actually even answered. But it's interesting that the group of farmers that are probably in the better, what you say, the better category of farmers are actually using slightly more. A bit of bias in this, and you need to acknowledge that. So there's a risk of underestimation here because the denominator obviously changes throughout the season. So we're taking that denominator, which is essentially cows just pre-calving. We'll lose cows around calving. Cows are culled, and cows are sold, and cows are moved on. So we're probably underestimating from that perspective. That's probably the biggest source of bias. There's a risk of over or underestimation depending on, people buy antimicrobials and they might use them the following season, or they might have some left over or whatever. And there's also, we assume that these antimicrobials are going into that farm, but then some farmers have young stock raised somewhere else, and they could be going to young stock and whatnot. I don't think these are that significant in the scheme of things. There is some good news on the horizon, and so it's not all bad news about our use of antimicrobials. And if you that way inclined and you think that using honey for mastitis treatment is particularly effective, you'll be very pleased to know that where they use honey, we're beginning to see some evidence of resistance to honey. So in other words, the key thing here, and it's a really important message, if you expose bacteria to heat, you select for heat resistance bacteria, and somebody made the point earlier on. It's just there's 40 trillion bacteria in our body, and we're continually selecting for the ones that are going to survive better. And someone's also alluded to this, but this is Mark Thomas's work from New Zealand and published a couple of years ago, and this is community antibiotic use in the medical field. And I like this graph, because it shows that New Zealand in the human medical field is actually not doing very well in terms of antimicrobial use, and in fact it's the third highest user of antimicrobials. And community antibiotic use is roughly about 80% of all human medical antibiotic use, about 20% is in hospital. So it's a good proxy for overall antimicrobial use. And so, there is that tension, and that sort of One Health tension. It's the livestock producers, or it's the human medical field. And I think, we can demonstrate that certainly our overall usage in livestock in New Zealand is quite positive compared to the medical field. So in summary, I think, I'm slightly biased, but I think it's very important for our profession to lead this space. I think it's really important that we own that space and that we don't give it up to politicians in the first instance. And you know, the Dutch have responded remarkably to their dictum from the politicians. But I can remember sitting in these sort of conferences 4 or 5 years ago and just being appalled at that sort of that approach to things, and how are they going to handle it. Now the Dutch are quite unique, and they will respond. But I can guarantee the Kiwis wouldn't do near as good a job. So what we've kind of done is own that space and say, look, just leave it to us. We will get this sorted. We're working on dry cow therapy at the moment, for example. And it's a bit like Theo said, you know, we've got to convince actually the vets, because the farmers would love to use less dry cow therapy or dry cow antimicrobial therapy. We've got a lot of good teat sealants now. So the farmers are in that space. We've got to move the veterinary profession along. The other thing is it's not a single species issue, so it's all issue, you know, all species issue, and it's a cross species. It's a One Health issue, and it isn't a single agency issue. We think it should be a cross party issue. The dairy industry usage in New Zealand, as I said, is low by international standards, but that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be doing things, and it doesn't mean to say that we couldn't make significant reductions again. So we could do some changes to dry cow antimicrobial treatment. And just referring back to that statement, I think I've got time for some questions and any comments.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we have time for one question.
Hi there, Gwen Rees from the University of Bristol. Thanks for a brilliant talk. You say that farm level and cow level data is poor in New Zealand. I believe that's a problem in many countries, but how do you think we can improve that data?
That's a good question. I think there's two ways, obviously, mechanisms for capturing the data, because it needs to be easy. I mean, it's not that it doesn't get recorded, but it gets recorded on a paper trail or in a yellow notebook or something. It's really hard. That's fine from a farmer perspective, but we don't want it in that format. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is to raise awareness of the value of it. So, you know, we're as guilty as anybody. If we don't use that data and show farmers that we can actually make use of it, then he sees no value in it. So why would I bother to record it? So it's interesting that, you know, they were talking about the farmers measuring their antimicrobial use. We've had some of our overseas owners in particular, we've challenged them in the past 3 to 4 years to reduce antimicrobial use by 10% year on year. And they really like that. You know, we give them a target and they like that. And there's not, I mean, that's very unscientific, but I think if you can demonstrate that the data is important, they will get it.
Brilliant, thank you.
So thank you very, very much to Mark, and he'll be around for some questions afterwards, indeed.